Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be looking into industrial architecture, primarily from the 1800s, and architecture that had a relationship with providing gas lighting to areas. So let's get into it. Now, I got started looking into this subject actually as a result of a commenter that had me look into the disaster that had happened in Eastern Java. I think it started in 2006 or thereabouts, but you had these mud volcanoes and a lot of villages were flooded with a lot of mud and a lot of this sediment and clay as well. And the blame was placed on the drilling for natural gas. So just these operations, these man-made operations that can trigger these destructive events. But it was interesting that a lot of clay was brought to the surface because I've talked about this a lot, but the buried blocks of Melbourne, which were rediscovered in 2017, they found about a meter of clay, so a little over 3 feet of clay over a lot of these buried sites in the central business district of Melbourne. So I kind of reject the mainstream narrative that the city council told people they had to leave the area and then all this clay was deposited. I think there was some destructive event. So something like a mud volcano seems like a plausible theory, but it just kind of reminded me of this. So I kind of wanted to look along these lines of potentially looking at natural gas, coal gas, and their relation to star forts, as well as some of these architecture. And it just reminded me of this video from the New Earth channel where she was talking about this older star fort in Russia, I believe, which is now in a state of disrepair. But there are some structures relatively close to this star fort which appear to be tapping into something underneath this star fort. I don't know if it's natural gas or what they're potentially tapping into, but it just gave me the idea as well to look at some of these star forts. And I found one that seems to be close to an oil and gas company, and it's in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and it's called Fort Clarence. Now, this fort actually is now buried, but we're told it was built by the British in the 1750s and rebuilt with stone in the 1860s, but I think it's probably older than that. But it was covered with dirt and capped in the 1940s in order for an oil refinery to be built on top. So could there be something to this? Are some of these star forts sitting on top of natural gas deposits, or is there a geothermal aspect to them? Who knows? But just sort of looking into this in an introductory way. Here's just an overhead of an older image and on top of a newer image and what this fort looked like and where it would have been. So I thought I'd look at another star fort, and there's one in Detroit, Michigan. This is the Detroit River, and it's called Fort Wayne, the historic Fort Wayne Star Fort. And very close to it, there's also another power station, which used to be a Detroit Edison power station, but it provided gas lighting to the people of Detroit at one point. I think it's largely abandoned, but at one point it provided coal gas as a means of providing lighting to the people in the area. But at one point, could there be something to this relationship with these oil and gas companies and these star forts? I'm not sure at this point, but it got me looking down along these lines. So then I wanted to start looking at some of these gas companies from the 1800s, and I came across some interesting looking structures. And when I looked at this structure that is in Toronto, Ontario, we're told it was built in the 1800s by the Consumer Gas Company as a purifying house. What was of interest to me is just that it was designed in the style of an early Christian basilica. So just an interesting choice to have this consumer gas company in this industrial architecture, have it look like a Christian basilica, because I think the speculation is that there's a lot of structures that might have been repurposed along the lines, especially in the 1800s. So could some of the structures that look like churches actually have had an industrial purpose in the past? And I'm not the first one to raise these questions, but just looking into it for myself. So I started looking at some of these other gas works, and I came across the Warwick Gas Works, and it's got these two octagonal gas holders, but you could see how it sort of looks like a structure that might be attached to a church at one point. So just interesting to look at, but underneath it's just this red brick structure. And where things got really interesting for me is when I started looking at Philadelphia's gas network and some of their coal gas production facilities, and you come across structures that look like this. And this is the Point Breeze Gas Works, and it's from the, I believe, mid 1800s. But this structure is a Gothic revival style with gray granite retort house sporting these arched lancet windows and buttresses. So if you didn't know any better, you might think, without the descriptions, you might think this was a church, but it's actually a coal gas retort house. But it's interesting, some of the features that we see on churches, they show up in some of these gas works. And from the same article, they just mention how what Gothic revival style meant in an industrial context has not yet been fully explored. So it's just, again, interesting choice, Gothic revival style, which looks like a church, but it's actually, they're producing basically coal gas. So it's just really odd, but I found another article talking about this site in just, when you look at these structures, some of the names, the purifying houses, aka Church Row, really interesting to me. And we got the rows, where the rose windows would be, the circular windows on churches, they were used for ventilation. And some of the structures have bells, at the top, which were functional, completely different purpose than what we would see on a church. Some more photos of this site, and a lot of this site, the buildings have been razed, but I think there's still a few around. What I did want to bring up in this particular image are just showing how some of the doors and windows have been repurposed, but I just wanted to bring up this point from this article, just talking about how mid-19th century ecclesiastical publications, they opposed the use of this Gothic style for industrial structures, such as a gas production factory, because this site here, Point Breeze Gas Works, I guess it looked, at least according to them, crudely like this parish church called St. James the Less in East Falls, which I believe is also in Philadelphia. And I guess why that was an issue is because this other church, I guess it looks like another church called St. Michael's, which apparently was a template or a recommended design for parish Gothic churches. So this gasworks and some of these structures, they bear striking resemblance to a lot of parish churches, which is interesting, and here's that church, St. James the Less, which I guess is a template that is used for a lot of parish churches, which just so happen to look like some of these structures that we find at this Point Breeze Gasworks. So again, we're not coming to any conclusions at this point. We're just looking at some of these structures. And there's even a precedent for some of these gasworks to be transformed into churches. You have some of these articles, former gas retort house recycled into a church, and former gas retort house in Birmingham has been refitted for use as a local church. So just interesting that we see some of the crossover between these structures that were industrial at one point transformed into a church. So we're just kind of observing at this point and taking note. The Gothic revival style was employed in the design of at least a few American gaswork facilities, and I believe this one is Manhattan, this is Buffalo, and I believe this was U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. So that got me looking at the Gothic revival style a bit more. And I believe the Gothic revival style primarily is around the mid-1700s throughout pretty much most of the 1800s. So let's just give it a good 150 years or so. And when I started looking up the differences between Gothic and Gothic revival, when we're talking Gothic, we have the Gothic cathedrals, for instance. So some of the key characteristics of Gothic architecture and structures like the cathedrals, they're built at an earlier point of time, and they're primarily composed of stone and glass. That's going to be a key point. And then when you look at Gothic revival architecture, and again, we're told that period of time is much later, and that's primarily 1750 to, let's say, 1900. So not only do those structures have stone and glass incorporated, but also iron and steel. So usually iron is not associated with this earlier Gothic period, well, at least with regards to this Gothic architecture. So why am I bringing that up? Because in some of these Gothic cathedrals, including St. Peter's Cathedral in Beauvais, France, they're finding that there was actually iron in the initial phase of the construction. And I'm going to get to that, but again, this is another Gothic cathedral that was at one point something else. This particular cathedral was a Romanesque basilica, but now it got one of these Gothic facelifts, so that's what we have today. Now, having said that, I want to focus on this finding from this research team that was looking at a few of these cathedrals in 2014, these Gothic cathedrals, and especially this one, St. Peter's Cathedral in Beauvais, France. They actually found that they were using iron in the initial construction of this cathedral, at least the Gothic phase of this cathedral, which would have been in the 1200s. Again, just keep in mind, traditionally, Gothic architecture is just thought to typically be constructed using stone and glass. And it's not until the 1700s and the Gothic revival architecture that you get the introduction of iron and steel, and it's typically associated with the Industrial Revolution as well. So there are these building materials, once again, in these cathedrals that actually date much closer to us in the timeline, but they're showing up in these cathedrals from the 1200s. And people knew that there was iron associated with these cathedrals, but they assumed it was added at a later point for reinforcement. But as I said, they're now finding that it was part of the initial construction. And why I think that's interesting is because in my video previous to this one, I touched on this other cathedral called Bourges Cathedral. And it just so happens Bourges Cathedral is another cathedral that they studied with regards to the prevalence of the use of iron in the initial construction. Bourges Cathedral was another one of the cathedrals that was researched, and they determined, iron was part of the initial construction. And I mentioned in the previous video how Bourges, they found that what was also used in the construction of this Gothic period of this structure was natural cement. And natural cement, we're told it was primarily in use in the 1800s, both in Europe and in North America. And actually, in both cases, the ability to recreate that natural cement was lost and had to be rediscovered in the 2000s. But I touched upon this in the previous video. This natural cement, with regards to this Bourges Cathedral, it was mislabeled. And back in 1992, I mentioned how initially they thought that the mortar that was used was this gypsum mortar, and that it was used in the initial construction of this cathedral in the 1200s. But then they later found out, it wasn't gypsum mortar, it was this natural cement. And now they're saying that the reason why you find this natural cement is because it was part of a historical restoration in the 1800s. But over here, back in 1992, they weren't calling it natural cement. They mislabeled it as gypsum mortars, and they're saying it was part of the initial construction in the 1200s. So just once again, in these cathedrals, we're finding these elements, these construction materials, the cement and the iron, that date closer to us in the timeline, at least according to the official history, but they're showing up in these cathedrals that date to like the 1200s. So it's just something I just wanted to add to this video because it builds on my previous video, and I think it's an interesting find. So ultimately, what does that mean? I'm not sure, but I think this natural cement that was the ability to recreate it was lost. I think it's actually older than they're telling us. And I think a lot of these structures are older than they're telling us. So I don't believe the dates of the 1800s for a lot of the structures that are using this natural cement. But I think that's all I have for you for today. I just want to give a big shout out to all my patrons. Really appreciate all your support, and I thank you very much. So having said that, until next time, take care. Bye.